If putting virtual machines in Azure hasn't been your thing, you've probably ignored Azure Automation as well. In my career, I've always been a VMware guy, and I've always worked for companies that had their own data centers, so I've never needed to spin up VMs in Azure. It just never made financial sense. Thus, in turn, I completely ignored Azure Automation because I didn't need to automate those non-existent VMs. Fast forward to my day job now, and a software vendor decided to upgrade their user provisioning with Azure AD. This upgrade just happened to remove the ability to use dynamic Azure AD groups to provision said users. So I'm not going to say which vendor it is because this isn't a unique situation, but it would sure be swell if this vendor happened to make a better product. Hopefully at the end of the contract, I can bid a fond farewell to this product. Well, if it's not obvious at this point, I don't like this software, but I have to deal with it for another year so I can hopefully replace it with Veeam. Now, to be able to keep my managers happy and accounting happy, I'm determined to beat them at their game. And it just happens to be the perfect example to show how you can automate Microsoft 365 administrative tasks with PowerShell in the cloud with Azure Automation. Lazy vendor not included. Welcome everyone, my name is Terry and this is my lab. Today, I'm going to show you how to take your interactive PowerShell script for Exchange and Microsoft Graph, convert it to be an unattended script, then move it to Azure Automation so you don't have to keep a computer on to run it, then to convert the identity for Exchange Online to a managed identity, and then one last little tidbit of useful information at the end, which will be a surprise, so stick around to the end. Now let's get started. A common interactive script looks something like this. You log into Exchange Online, you log into Graph, and the script goes and grabs some variable information, and it does its thing. This script isn't anything crazy. All it does is grab all the mailboxes in Exchange Online, loops through them, and assigns them to a corresponding group based off of the type of mailbox it is. As I said, this isn't anything crazy. After running the script manually for a few days, you'll want to automate it. Once you do that, the script will look something like this. The only real difference in this is now you have some extra verbiage at the top of the script to use an app registration rather than your prompts to sign in. Because of all the options for app registration, and that is basically required now, it sounds a lot more complicated than it is. Don't worry about catching the specific text of all these scripts in the video. I have everything documented below. Just hit up the description. We got links to GitHub for the scripts, every version of it, Microsoft's documentation. Don't worry about that one. Just watch the video for the overall process. We're all at different levels of script writing, automation, and administration of Microsoft 365. So if you're thinking to yourself, hey Terry, this sounds like something I could use to automate part of my job, but I've never written scripts with PowerShell, well, you're in luck. We're going to start from the beginning. To effectively and easily write this PowerShell script, you'll both need the Exchange Online PowerShell module and the Microsoft Graph modules. Let's install them quickly. Personally, I do love how Microsoft has updated PowerShell to be more Linux-esque, where from the command line you can just easily install the missing modules rather than going to the website, downloading it, closing the prompt, reopening it, repeat. Technically, you could copy and paste my scripts, and as long as you set up Azure Automation correctly and update the corresponding pieces for your tenant, then the scripts would work. But if you want to test, run them locally, use IntelliSense in VS Code, you're going to need the modules installed to populate the syntax and descriptions of the commands to get that information in there for troubleshooting and development purposes. All right, step one complete. Now let's go and automate it. To convert this script into an unattended script, we have to create an app registration. It sounds more complicated than it is. Microsoft provides documentation specifically for Exchange Online that you can piggyback off of for Graph to set this up. And when it comes to app registrations, everything under the sun is an option. To make this an unattended script, step one is to create an app registration for it. This aligns with the modern auth approach that Microsoft is taking. Once the app registration is created, we have to specify and approve the APIs that this script is going to need access to, then assign the Azure roles to the app registration as well, and then lastly, create a self-signed certificate for authentication purposes. Then we got to update the script to use all the stuff we set up, but we got to set it up first. I'm also grabbing group IDs from Azure for reference during this step, since I'm going to be building the script with you guys as we go. Microsoft has a guide that cuts through most of the extra fluff when creating an app registration for Exchange Online management. It's going to be linked below, so you can easily copy and paste the stuff that you'll see on the screen. But we're going to start from the beginning. When creating an app registration, name it something intuitive. This name will show up in the logs when you're troubleshooting access. Now we have to edit the manifest of the app registration to add the Exchange Manage as App permission to it. It's as simple as finding a spot in this text document and copy and pasting it and save. Again, it's all documented in the article. Since we're using service principals and not embedded user accounts or client secrets, we need a certificate for authentication when the script runs. Don't worry, it doesn't need to be a paid for certificate. A self-signed certificate will work just fine. And this will come down to which modules are your scripts using. In our case here, Exchange Online does support client secrets, but Microsoft Graph does not. So your choice is either setting up both of them, so one module can use a certificate and one module can use a client secret, or just using a certificate for both of them. Gonna go with just the two-for option here to make life a little bit easier. As I said before, with Microsoft cutting out the fluff, they did it again to make the certificate. Assuming you are on a Windows computer, just make sure you update the Microsoft Contoso properties with your actual organization, and set a reminder to make sure you renew that certificate on a yearly basis. Now open an MMC console on your computer to export the certificate and the private key to be able to upload it into the app registration. You'll need to specify the certificate thumbprint in the connection information in the script. Lastly, after you upload the certificate, to the app registration. Don't delete it because you're going to need it for Azure Automation down the line. Once your Exchange items are done, you can go and add the Graph API permissions. In this case, we only need group, read, and write. Now you can shotgun blast approving all the permissions at once. Once your Exchange items are done, you can go in and add your Graph permissions into this app registration. In this case, we only need group, read, and write. So we can just put them all into a pending state right here. Now shotgun the approval all at once, and we're good to go. For this video, I'm building this solution ground up in my Office 365 environment. So we need some groups for me to organize my users into to demo it. I am creating two security groups, one for user mailboxes, and this group also signifies the users who need licenses in this software, for example, to back up SharePoint, OneDrive, all that stuff. You're basically, if you have a user mailbox, you're getting the license that grants you everything else in Office 365. The second group is for all the free stuff that doesn't need to back up OneDrive. That is technically a different license, but is free by this vendor, but is not smart enough to figure it out on its own. So this covers shared mailboxes, resource rooms, all those things that don't directly cost money, but use a mailbox behind the scenes. In this case, I am hard coding the groups into the script because this isn't going to change until there's a software change. If your environment is a little bit more dynamic, you can make your script dynamic as well to align with it. Before we move this over to Azure Automation, let's make sure the unattended version script works locally before we add the details of the cloud into the mix. We got to first update the script connection information, and then let's give it a try. And it helps when you actually hard code those group IDs that you mentioned you're going to do just a moment ago. Let's give it another try. All right, hyphens, equal signs, not the same thing. They do different things. Okay, third time's a charm, please.
Yes!
And we're good, let's move on. To set up Azure Automation, you need an Azure subscription, just like everything else. But in theory, this solution could be a free solution for you depending upon how you use it. Azure Automation is built on how long your scripts take to run. As of July 2023, when I'm recording this, for the central Azure region, let's throw all the disclosures and disclaimers out there, you get the first 500 minutes for free, and then after that it's billed at 0.002 cents per minute. There's additional items if you want desired state control, if you're using this with Azure VMs, but for just basic script running on Microsoft or Python, this could be effectively a free solution. I have a more complex version of the script running every day, and it takes 1.5 minutes to run, and it's processing thousands of users and hundreds of free mailboxes. So in my worst case scenario here, it takes 1.5 minutes to run, and I'm running it every day for a month. So that is 45 minutes out of my 500 free minutes per month. This is starting to sound a lot more like a cell phone commercial from the early 2000s more than an Azure Automation video, but I'm gonna make sure to run my script when my night and weekend minutes kick in tonight. I'm skipping the subscription part because it's straightforward to set one up. And if you don't have one right now, trials do work if you need to demo this in a proof of concept setup. So once you have your subscription sorted out, go to portal.azure.com and search for Azure Automation. Click Add to make an Azure Automation account. Just like everything else Azure related, you have to add it to or create a resource group. If you're going to script items that live in resource groups, then reuse the existing resource groups. If you don't have anything, then be creative when creating a resource group and be intuitive with the name. For the account name, just name it something intuitive. Likewise, you'll be using this name every time you need to make changes to the process, and will be in the audit logs as well. For the last item on this page, pick the region that makes the most sense for you and your use case. On the Advanced tab, you can create managed identities. Leave system assigned check. The difference between the two are system assigned lives with the Azure Automation account and is effectively built into it and only can be used within the Azure Automation account. The user assigned account is a service account that exists outside of the Azure Automation account that can be used in Azure Automation, can be used in the virtual machines and your other Azure processes. This is an important part, but we'll come back to it after we get the initial unattended script migrated to Azure Automation. Depending upon what your script is doing or where it's connecting to, you might not need either account type, or you might have to use one over the other. Network connectivity, because we're only connecting to public URLs like the PowerShell for Exchange Online, the Microsoft Graph one, we don't need to worry about the private networking option here. Again, if this was for Azure VMs, where you're trying to run these scripts using the internal connection points in your networking there, then it becomes very important. So this is very dependent upon what your actual use case is. For this walkthrough, we only need public access because there isn't a internal version of Graph or Exchange Online. And the last page, if you use tags in your environment, apply them here and then create your account. With Azure Automation, just like your local computer, wherever you want your script to run from, it needs some modules. So we have to go and add them in to Azure Automation. To add them in, you simply go to modules and then browse gallery. Pick the module and the version of it that you want to run and click install. For this solution here, we need the following modules: Exchange Online Management, Microsoft Graph Authentication, Microsoft Graph Users, and Graph Groups. The only gotcha with this is if any of your modules have dependencies, those dependency modules must be installed and finished installing first. So as you saw when we installed the Graph components locally, it just shotgun blasted everything to do with Graph all in one installer, and you had everything good to go. Because this is cloud and they're trying to keep everything streamlined and optimized, they subdivided all of the Graph modules into individual pieces. So in our case here, we have to install Microsoft Graph Authentication first before we can install Graph users or Graph groups. Now you can install modules that don't overlap or don't depend on each other at the same time. So we can do Exchange Online at the same time as authentication. We just can't do users and groups. The only downside with this one is, start to finish in this environment is about 2 minutes for it to install, which, as you see, the user interaction here takes a whole 5 seconds. There's no progress bar or anything like that. So that 2 minutes, even though it's relatively quick, feels like an eternity as you're just clicking refresh. Is it done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? We need the certificate and the private key that we created earlier. Go to your Azure Automation account in the shared resources section and go to certificates. Click add and you'll upload the certificate. It's going to see that it has a private key with it. The password field is going to appear. Type in the password and your certificate is ready to use. Now let's add the script to Azure Automation using the Visual Studio Code extension. This part is technically optional, but in my opinion, it is infinitely better to use Visual Studio Code with the Azure Automation extension rather than manually editing files, using the web browser, uploading, and repeating that process over and over again to find all your typos. To add the extension, just go to the marketplace in Visual Studio Code, search Azure Automation. It's also going to pull in Azure Authentication if you don't already have it. Sign in as you, and it's going to automatically bring in all of the subscriptions you're a part of that have Azure Automation accounts associated with. Azure Automation uses runbooks to run your PowerShell or Python scripts. We need to create one of those. Go to the runbook section, right click on it and select create runbook. Give it a name without spaces in the name and end it in .ps1 to say that it's a PowerShell script. If you put spaces in the name, it can break some of the automated testing that's built into Azure Automation. So save yourself some heartache, skip the spaces. After your empty runbook is created, open up the unattended script, press Control A to select all of it, Control C to copy all of it, and then Control V to paste it into our runbook. Then right click on the runbook and hit publish. If the certificate's uploaded successfully and it's the same one, when we run it, it should work without an issue. Assuming you upload the certificate to the certificate's part with the private key and then you added all the modules correctly, this script should run exactly as it did from our local computer. To verify it, let's right click on the published script and select Start Automation Job. If it's not published already, right, publish it first. Then when it asks you where you'd like to run it, say Azure. Lastly, it's going to ask you if you want to see the output, say yes. Success. As you can see, it worked, as the video showed, it worked successfully locally, and it still works now. Now that we know it works in Azure Automation, we can create a schedule for it to run on. In this example, I'm just going to create a daily schedule that's good enough for this specific use case. Obviously, update your scripts as needed for your organization's needs and budgets. In the web portal, go to shared resources and then select schedules and then click add. Give it a name and description as needed, make sure it's intuitive, and then set the first available interval. So if you're doing a daily interval, it has to either be later in the same day at the current time or the next day from when you're configuring it. Set your recurrence options, and if you want the script to expire on a schedule, then click OK. After the schedule is complete, go to the runbook and select link to schedule and pick the schedule. You can have multiple schedules and multiple scripts in Azure Automation, so you can mix and match as needed. At this point, your basic migration to Azure Automation is complete. Next, we'll go through how to convert this runbook to use a managed identity for Exchange Online. And then the extra bonus, I promise, don't worry, I didn't forget it. Managed identities sound great in theory. They're locked to the automation process, they don't require app registrations, they simplify connection information, but the downside is they aren't available for everything in Microsoft 365. Like in this example, disclaimer alert, as of July 2023, I can use managed identities for Exchange Online in this script, but they are not available for Microsoft Graph yet. So for our demo purposes, it's going to be split in half. In the real world, use what makes sense for your deployment. If you're going to load up Azure Automation account with a ton of Exchange stuff, then it makes total sense to use the managed identity, simplify your configuration, and away you go. If the Azure Automation account is more of a holding spot for a bunch of random random scripts, you got some Python, you got Exchange Online, you got where no two scripts go to the same destination, then it might make more sense to just kind of line the authentication of your script for its usage and leave managed identities to the side. Obviously, as Microsoft, they're going to keep updating their stuff to work better with their own stuff, so this could all be a moot point a year from now. The process to set up your managed identity is similar to setting up an app registration. You need to grant it the run as app permission through PowerShell, assign it the corresponding roles. Fun fact, there is a bug that you'll see in a moment here that if you're connected to the Azure account module in PowerShell and you want to connect to the Microsoft Graph module at the same time, your permissions assignment will fail. That's all the red you're seeing on the screen here as I'm going through this process to set it up here. The Microsoft guide as you're going through this assumes you don't have anything set up. So first it has you sign into the Azure account section to spin up the Azure Automation account first, and the resource group, all that stuff where you need that. Whereas in our case that we're converting it afterwards, everything's already signed up. So the only point of that Azure accounts section is to grab the object ID dynamically, and then creating the variable and going forward. To get around that, go to Azure Automation account and grab the object ID from account settings and system assigned, and also while you're there, make sure it's turned on. I believe it is by default, but just in case. And then update the Microsoft section of this PowerShell command with the hard-coded object ID instead of the command to grab it dynamically. After all the PowerShell is done, go into Azure AD and assign the Azure roles to the managed identity, just like the app registration. The last step is to update our runbook with the managed identity settings and then test it, obviously, just because that's a common theme too. This does simplify the connection line. Instead of the certificate thumbprint in the app IDs, you just replace all that with dash managed identity and then your URL, and you're off and running. Now that the script is up to date, go ahead and test it. You've watched me test this already 3 times plus at this point. I'm gonna skip it this time, but then we're gonna end up running it one more time with the little bonus section I got coming up right now. Personally, I've been over email-based alerting for a long time. If you've been in IT for any amount of time, email-based alerts are usually way too vague, way too many of them, and they have a tendency to bury all the important stuff around all the stuff that's unimportant. Outlook seems to agree with my thought on this, or at least in my current role, because the focused inbox takes all of my current alerting and puts in the other category, and I don't see any of it, luckily. Every once in a while I just check it, Control A and hit delete to make sure I don't miss anything, but overall, email alerts are way too noisy. So whenever possible, I personally create alerts in a Microsoft Teams channel, because then I know if there's an alert on that channel, it's something I actually have to care about and not noise. There are many ways to get notifications to pop into a Teams channel, but the one I'm going to use for this case is how to update this script to send a message card directly to a Teams channel using an incoming webhook. And you might be saying, Derry, it's adaptive cards now, it's not message cards, that's old school. And normally I'd agree with you, but another disclaimer, this should be the last one. As of July 2023, if you're using incoming webhooks on a Microsoft Teams channel, it only still supports message cards. It does not support adaptive cards, at least yet. If you want to use an adaptive card, you can route this through something like Power Automate or get more involved on the scripting and the connection properties. But this is just a much more linear an easy to configure solution where you just kind of tack on this message block, update the statistics that you want to see in it, and script runs, sends the alert, you're done. Just in case you're unfamiliar with configuring and customizing Microsoft Teams or team channels, let's just start at the beginning. In an existing team channel, let's add the incoming webhook connector and change the name and the picture too if you want to make it more intuitive. Then grab that URL and throw it in the notepad for a moment because you're going to need it in your scripting. Now let's update the Teams section of the Teams version of this script. It's the same script that we were working with before, except it has the Teams chunk at the bottom of the script and it has a couple more variables for doing some calculations based off of the numbers from the group membership and the mailbox types, etc. First, paste the URL of the Teams incoming webhook into the variable. The code at the bottom of the script does everything else. It basically organizes everything into a custom object that's formatted for JSON, which is what everything runs in on Teams basically. And then you can update the card pieces with title, description, all of that stuff. But the fact set on the bottom here is the main chunk of it, where it's here's how many users change, plus or minus. This is the count of license you need in this application that needs to go away from that vendor that shall not be named. Now we can hit save and we can publish it to Azure AD and run the script. We'll watch the whole thing go through and watch it come into Teams. Now that we've taken a interactive script, moved it into the cloud so it can run automatically and pipe out a notification to Teams for free, I want to thank you all for watching. In an upcoming video, I'm going to take this to the next step of linking Azure Automation to Azure DevOps so we can have team collaboration with version control and automatic syncing of new scripts from DevOps to Azure Automation. So look out for that to come out. If you want to see more videos about Microsoft 365, Azure, or me building random things that are loosely related to woodworking or landscaping, click that subscribe button and a notification bell. Feel free to leave any comments, questions, concerns down below. And until next time, keep building.